I never thought I'd be the kid who transferred to an alien school. My parents always said I was different, but this was beyond different. I had lived on Earth my whole life, but a new promotion from my father sent us to Viltoria 4, a planet so far from Earth that I had to take 3 ships, 4-dimensional jumps, and 1 unstable wormhole to get here. Earth was home. It was where I understood the rules. Gravity-defying sports, school dances, and 1,000 other simple things that now seemed impossibly distant. Viltoria the Fourth was nothing like Earth. The air smelled thick like something alive, and the ground shifted beneath my feet like a living thing. Buildings were made of materials I couldn't name, structures that bent in ways I couldn't quite grasp. The sky was greenish-pink, with 3 moons floating lazily overhead. And the clouds? They weren't clouds. They were floating colonies of sentient gas, occasionally emitting faint flashes of light as they passed by. It was beautiful, and yet it felt like stepping into a completely different reality. The school I was enrolled in was a massive, spiraling complex with halls that defied the laws of physics I'd grown up with. My parents were excited, of course. My father's promotion had required a shift to an entirely different planetary system, and my mother was keen on the idea of experiencing a new culture. But me? I felt like a goldfish dropped into a tank of piranhas. On my first day, I was given a tour by a soft-spoken assistant named Chloe. Chloe was a short, spherical creature with skin that shifted color depending on his mood, and he spoke with an odd hum that resonated in the air. It was unsettling at first, but I soon learned that this was normal here. As Chloe showed me around, I caught glimpses of students, my future classmates, scuttling around the halls, each one stranger than the last. There were the Viltorians, with their serpentine bodies and retractable limbs. There were the Yethrians, tall and elongated, with pale, translucent skin and complex facial ridges. And then there were the Jorvans, energy beings that flickered in and out of existence, their forms never quite solidifying into anything I could describe. When the bell finally rang and I found myself standing outside my first classroom, my stomach twisted in knots. The door opened with a strange hiss, and I stepped inside, fully aware of how odd I must have looked to my new peers. I was the only human in the room, the only one with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a face that didn't have any extra eyes, tentacles, or floating energy halos. The teacher, a 6-armed mantis-like creature with sharp, glinting eyes, welcomed me with an unnervingly warm tone. "Human?" she said, her voice an odd mix of clicking and buzzing. A rare specimen indeed. I wasn't sure if she was joking or if she truly found my kind to be some kind of oddity. The class was already seated, well, I thought they were seated, until I realized that some of them were floating and others were, for lack of a better term, resting in the air. I hesitated before finding an empty desk, which morphed and adapted around my body, the technology responding to my human form. That was when I realized that the desk might not be built for creatures like me at all. It was going to be a long year. But they were curious, these strange creatures, these alien students. They stared at me with wide eyes. Some of them whispered in low tones, communicating in languages I couldn't even begin to understand. Others telepathically projected thoughts into my mind, though they were often too jumbled to make sense of. The teacher began the lesson, but it was clear that everyone was more interested in me than the topic at hand. I fidgeted uncomfortably in my seat. Still, as strange as everything was, there was something strangely exhilarating about it all. These students, with their endless variety of forms and minds, were clearly more advanced in many ways. But there was something deeply human about being here, something that kept me from feeling completely out of place. I may not have understood their world, but for the first time in my life, I had a chance to experience a world that wasn't my own. And maybe, just maybe, I could teach them something too. It was, after all, a school full of aliens, and I was the only human. As the days passed, I began to get used to the oddities of my new life. The strange shifts in gravity, the translucent walls that morphed depending on the time of day, and even the constant hum of the atmosphere that seemed to vibrate in sync with the pulse of the planet. All of it became normal in a way I hadn't expected. But it wasn't just the environment that was different. My classmates were unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Each day felt like I was stepping into a new world of creatures that defied logic and biology. Zork was one of the first students to truly approach me. A large, scaled reptilian with 4 eyes, he was a towering figure compared to my small human frame. He looked intimidating at first, his chrome-like scales reflecting the faint light of the classroom. His long tail snaked around behind him, flicking in a rhythm that I couldn't decipher. But when he spoke, I was taken aback by the warmth of his voice. "Hello, humane," Zork said, his tongue flicking out slightly as he spoke. He used a universal translator device, a small chip embedded in his throat that allowed him to communicate in languages other than his own. "I have seen humans on my travels. You are interesting." I wasn't sure whether to be flattered or scared. "Thanks," I said, offering him a nervous smile. "I'm just a regular human." He cocked his head to the side, examining me like I was a strange specimen. I had gotten used to the curious stares, though Zork's were different. It wasn't judgment, but more like a genuine search for understanding. "Interesting," he repeated. "You walk on 2 legs. Your skin is soft but tough. You are fragile, but you survive." He gave a slow nod. "Yes, very interesting." I didn't quite know how to respond, so I simply nodded along. Zork seemed to take that as an invitation to continue his observation. He had a way of looking at things, a perspective I couldn't quite grasp. I began to learn that he was a biologist of sorts, constantly examining things around him, trying to decode the mechanics of life, both alien and human. In many ways, I felt like I was his subject, though he never made me feel uncomfortable. In fact, I soon found that he could be surprisingly insightful. Then there was Valora, who was an entirely different creature. Unlike Zork, who had a presence that was heavy and grounded, Valora was light, literally. She was a psychic, and her presence could be felt before she even entered the room. She communicated not with words but with emotions, a steady stream of calm thoughts that resonated in the air around her. Her skin was soft and pale, almost translucent, with faint glows emanating from her whenever she was deep in thought. Whenever she greeted me, it was with a soft smile, and I could feel a warmth in my chest, like a comforting breeze on a summer day. Valora's telepathic abilities made it easy for her to connect with me, even though I had no psychic powers of my own. She would often project her thoughts into my mind, and for a long time I could sense a kind of curiosity within her, a desire to understand me. But there was also something else, something I couldn't quite place, a fascination perhaps, a question lingering behind her calm demeanor. There was something deeply empathetic about Valora, a kindness that made her one of the few beings in this alien world that I could relate to. She made me feel less alone, even though she was nothing like me. One afternoon, while the class was taking a break, she leaned over to me and gently nudged my shoulder with hers. "I've been studying you," Valora said, her voice soft and almost melodic in my mind. "You're very different, but there is much to learn. You think and feel in ways we don't understand." I raised an eyebrow, unsure whether she was complimenting me or making an observation. I guess we humans are just built differently." "You are," she agreed. "But I see that you are not just different. You are strong, more resilient than most species I know." Her words were kind, but they also made me uneasy. I wasn't used to receiving compliments, and I wasn't sure if I was strong at all. In fact, I felt weak in many ways. But Valora's words stayed with me, echoing in the back of my mind. Maybe, despite all of my differences, I had something to offer these aliens. Then there was Sneth, the energy being who didn't seem to have a form at all. One moment he was a shifting cloud of blue light, and the next he had condensed into a humanoid shape. It was difficult to know if he had any true physical structure, but it was clear that Sneth didn't need one. He existed purely through energy, vibrating and shifting at will, and when he spoke, it was a strange amalgamation of thoughts, feelings, and electrical impulses that I could barely comprehend. Despite his abstract form, Sneth was incredibly sharp. He had a quick wit and often made jokes that left me in stitches, though I could tell his humor wasn't always appreciated by everyone. His personality was as fluid as his shape, constantly changing depending on his mood. One moment he'd be a carefree ball of energy, and the next he'd become quiet and withdrawn, retreating into himself as if the fluctuations of his energy had taken a toll on his psyche. Together, these three, Zork, Philora, and Sneth, were the core of my new social circle. They were kind to me in their own ways, and through them I was learning how to navigate a world so unlike Earth. It wasn't always easy, though. There were times when I felt like I was living in a dream, and other times when the weight of being the only human in an alien world hit me like a punch to the stomach. But I also knew something deep down. I was going to have to adjust, to learn, and to grow. I had no choice but to embrace this strange new reality. And somehow, I was starting to think I might just be able to survive it. The assignment seemed harmless at first, a simple task in xenobiology class. Choose one creature from Earth that you find the most fascinating and explain why. I had heard about this kind of assignment before. Back on Earth, students were often asked to write about animals they loved, but this was different. I wasn't just writing to impress my teacher. I was speaking to a room full of beings who had likely never even seen an Earth creature in person. The day before the presentation, I found myself thinking long and hard about which creature to choose. I knew I didn't want to pick something too obvious like a lion or a panda, animals that would have been easy choices but felt too cliché. I needed something that would stand out, something that would spark interest in my classmates. My mind kept returning to the hippopotamus. It wasn't a creature that people often thought about, and its nature had always intrigued me. Hippos are large, heavy, and usually seen as slow-moving. But the more I learned about them, the more I understood just how dangerous they could be. So I spent the evening researching everything I could about hippos. I found out that, despite their bulky appearance, they were capable of running up to 30 miles per hour on land, which was faster than a human. They spent most of their days lounging in water, but when provoked, they could charge with terrifying force. Hippos were also known for their territorial instincts, often becoming aggressive if they felt their space was being invaded. They didn't fit the stereotypical, gentle giant mold that many people assumed. The more I read about them, the more I realized that they were a perfect representation of how strength and danger often lie beneath the surface. And so, with a mix of excitement and nerves, I prepared my presentation. The next day, I stood in front of the class, holding a small device that projected holographic images of the hippopotamus. The students sat in their seats, most of them curious but confused. They had no idea what a hippopotamus was. To them, Earth's wildlife was as foreign as any alien species. I wasn't sure what kind of reaction I was expecting, but I certainly didn't think I'd get the one I did. "All right, class," I began, trying to sound confident. "Today, I'm going to talk to you about one of Earth's most misunderstood creatures, the hippopotamus." I clicked the device, and the first image of the hippopotamus appeared. It was a massive animal with thick gray skin and enormous jaws that could open to an impressive 150 degrees. "The hippopotamus may look docile," I continued, "but it is one of the most dangerous creatures in Africa. Despite their bulky size, hippos are surprisingly fast. They can run up to 30 miles per hour on land." I noticed Zork's eyes narrow as he studied the image, his 4 pupils focusing intently. "And they're not just fast," I added. "They are extremely territorial. If you get too close to one, it can charge you with terrifying force. And they're responsible for more human deaths in Africa than lions or other large predators." As I spoke, the room grew eerily quiet. The students shifted in their seats, exchanging confused glances. Zork's mouth hung slightly open, and I could sense his fascination, though it was quickly turning into something else. He had always appeared stoic and calm, but now there was a visible discomfort in his posture. Valora, who was usually so empathetic, seemed to withdraw into herself, her aura shifting into something distant and unsettled. Even Snaith, who usually flickered with energy and humor, was quiet, his form pulsating erratically as though something about the hippopotamus was disrupting his entire being. I was caught off guard. I had expected some surprise, but this was different. There was something in the air, something palpable that I couldn't quite explain. I continued, trying to push through the tension that had settled over the class. Hippos are often underestimated because they look slow and harmless, but they are one of the most dangerous animals on Earth. They can kill with a single bite. Their massive jaws can crush bones, and they're known for being unpredictable. I clicked the device again, showing a short video of a hippo charging at a boat, its large body crashing into the water with incredible speed. But despite their danger, hippos also have a softer side. They are social creatures, living in groups, and they spend a lot of time in the water to keep cool. They are, in a way, a perfect paradox, fierce yet peaceful. I finished the presentation, feeling somewhat relieved, but the silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke. The students sat motionless, and their wide, unblinking eyes were locked onto me, a mix of confusion and what seemed like fear. I thought I had done a decent job explaining the hippopotamus, but something was definitely off. Professor Exlath, who had been hovering in the background, watching the entire time, was the first to speak. Her antennae twitched, and her voice was low and cautious. "The hippopotamus," she repeated slowly, her tone carrying an edge of disbelief. "You chose the hippopotamus?" There was something in her voice, a hesitancy that I hadn't expected. She glanced around at the other students, who were all visibly pale. "Human," Zork spoke up, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Are you certain this is the creature you wanted to present?" "It is," he hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. "It is more than just an animal. It is a force." I blinked, confused. "It's just a big animal. I mean, yeah, it's dangerous, but—" "No," Valora interrupted, her voice distant but firm. "You don't understand. The hippopotamus is something that many species cannot fathom. We, the Viltorians, the Yethrians, even the Jorvans, we are not equipped to understand what the hippopotamus represents." Their words didn't make sense to me. I had simply chosen a creature I thought was interesting. But in that moment, I realized I had unintentionally touched on something far more profound than I had anticipated. Something about the hippopotamus had shaken them, something deep within their collective consciousness. And I had no idea what it was. The following days were filled with a quiet tension that I couldn't shake off. I had presented the hippopotamus with the best intentions, eager to share something uniquely earthly, but I had clearly stirred something in my classmates that I couldn't understand. Their reaction to the creature was like nothing I had ever experienced before. They weren't just surprised or impressed. They seemed unnerved. Zork avoided making eye contact with me for the next few days. It wasn't a deliberate act of rudeness, but more like a subtle distancing, as though something about the hippopotamus had triggered an unspoken fear. Valora, normally so open and gentle, kept her distance, her telepathic presence distant and hard to reach. Even Sneth, who rarely seemed to take anything seriously, had grown quiet, his form flickering in strange patterns that hinted at a deep unease. It wasn't until the third day after my presentation that I finally caught a glimpse of what was going on. I had stayed late after class to finish an assignment when I noticed Zork and Valora talking in low, hurried tones near the back of the classroom. They hadn't noticed me yet, so I kept my distance, thinking I'd overhear something useful without interrupting. "We cannot simply ignore this," Zork's voice rumbled, low and serious. "The human, their creature, it is not just an animal. It's something more, something ancient." Lamont rubbed his hands together and smiled. Valora's voice, usually calm and soothing, had a tremor of uncertainty in it. "But what does that mean? It's just a creature from their world. We've seen dangerous creatures before, but none like this one." Zork let out a low hiss, an involuntary sound of frustration. "It's not like anything we've encountered. It's a force, something we don't have words for, something that even our minds cannot fully grasp. The hippopotamus is not just a being. It's a part of their world's fabric, a symbol of power, of unpredictability." I blinked, confused. What in the world were they talking about? It was just a large territorial animal. They were acting like I had presented some kind of mythological monster. I stepped a little closer, trying to make sense of the conversation. Valora's voice softened, and I could hear the strain in it. "Zork, I don't understand. What makes the hippopotamus so different? We have dangerous creatures in our world. I've seen them. The Yethrians have their own deadly predators. But why does this one affect us so deeply?" Zork's response came in a low growl. "Because the hippopotamus is not bound by logic, by the usual order of things. It is a creature of pure force, a beast that exists to challenge and defy. There is a primal energy in it, something that cannot be reasoned with. It's raw, unfiltered power." I was about to step forward and confront them, but then Valora's voice rang out in my mind, her telepathic message clear and urgent. "Human, you should not be here." Inexorable, I froze, feeling a shiver run down my spine. It was one of the rare instances when Valora's mental presence was so intense that it felt like a physical sensation. My heart pounded, and I slowly backed away, not wanting to intrude on their private conversation any longer. I had no idea what they were talking about, but I could feel that whatever it wasn't something I was meant to understand just yet. The rest of the week passed with a strange, heavy silence hanging between us. I tried to go about my daily life as usual, but it became increasingly difficult. Every time I tried to engage with any of my classmates, I was met with avoidance, discomfort, or even outright fear. The energy in the room was different. I felt like I had become a pariah, like my very presence was causing unease among those around me. Finally, on the 6th day after my presentation, I couldn't take it anymore. I found Zork alone in the hallway, pacing back and forth, his long tail flicking with agitation. I took a deep breath and approached him, trying not to appear too desperate. "Zork," I said, hesitating for a moment, "what's going on? Why are you all acting like this? It's just a hippopotamus. It's just an animal." Zork stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. He seemed to weigh something in his mind before he finally spoke. "Human, do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and fear. "That creature, the hippopotamus, it's not just a creature, it's a symbol. It represents something that we and many others have tried to avoid for centuries. It's a manifestation of something primal, something we have learned to suppress." I furrowed my brow, completely lost. "What do you mean? It's just an animal. You're making this sound like some kind of myth." Zork shook his head slowly. "It's not a myth. The hippopotamus is tied to something much deeper. It represents the forces of destruction and chaos, things that can never truly be tamed. It is a force of nature, but not in the way that we understand it. It's something that we, as species, have evolved to avoid, to push aside. I took a step back, trying to process his words. Are you saying that a hippopotamus is somehow dangerous to all of you, even though you're so much more advanced? Zork's expression softened, though his eyes still held a trace of fear. In a way, yes. It's not about power, or technology, or strength. It's about something much more fundamental, something raw, something primal. The hippopotamus embodies that, and it's something that we, as an advanced species, are not supposed to confront. But you, human, you brought it into our world. He paused, looking at me with a strange mixture of awe and unease. You have shown us something we did not wish to see. The realization hit me like a wave. I hadn't just presented a creature from Earth. I had brought something far deeper to light, something that touched a nerve in these alien beings. And for the first time since arriving on Viltoria 4, I began to feel a deep, unsettling understanding of just how far my presence on this planet would take me. This wasn't just about learning to fit in anymore. This was about something far bigger than all of us. The weight of Zork's words hung heavily in my mind as I wandered the corridors of the academy, my thoughts swirling in confusion. What had I done? I had simply shared an animal from my world, one that I thought was interesting. I never anticipated that my choice would ignite such a reaction. The idea that a simple creature, something so mundane to me, could embody forces of chaos and destruction was almost too much to wrap my head around. I spent the next few days trying to make sense of it all. I had learned that my classmates were from species whose understanding of life and the universe seemed far more intricate and profound than anything I had ever known. They were a blend of science, philosophy, and mysticism, their minds shaped by millennia of advanced thinking. But none of them seemed ready for the hippopotamus, a creature that didn't fit the neat categories they had learned to live by. I had never truly understood what it meant to be human in the grander scheme of things, but I was beginning to feel that my existence was a part of a larger, more complex narrative, one that reached far beyond the confines of Earth. The more I learned about these alien species, the more I realized how deeply interconnected everything was. Our histories, our beliefs, our very nature, everything played a part in shaping the future of the galaxy. And in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend, my presence here had disrupted something far more delicate than I'd ever imagined. It was during one of the breaks when Valora approached me, her pale form floating gently through the hall. Her presence was calming, but there was a lingering sadness in her expression that I hadn't seen before. I had missed our conversations, the subtle mental exchanges we used to share, and I was eager to try to clear the air. "Human," she said softly, her voice resonating in my mind. "I know you don't understand why your choice of creature has affected us so, but I think it's important that you do." I nodded, feeling a wave of guilt and confusion wash over me. I didn't mean to cause any problems. I just thought the hippopotamus was interesting. I thought it would be a good way to share something about Earth. Valora's glow softened, and she moved closer, as if trying to connect with me on a deeper level. "It's not about the hippopotamus itself. It's what it represents. For many of us, creatures like that, raw, unpredictable, violent, they remind us of something we've spent centuries trying to forget, something we no longer speak of." Her words piqued my curiosity. "What do you mean? I thought you all had the technology to understand and control everything. What could a hippo have to do with anything you've gone through?" "There are forces in the universe, human, that even the most advanced species cannot control," Valora explained, her voice taking on a wistful tone. "The hippopotamus is a reminder of that, of a time before we learned to suppress those forces. Long ago, there were races and civilizations that thrived on destruction, chaos, and violence. Some of them were powerful enough to reshape entire systems, to manipulate energy itself. But the balance of the universe couldn't be kept. Everything that thrives on destruction eventually collapses in on itself. I struggled to keep up. So you're saying that the hippopotamus is a symbol of something like that, destruction. Valora's form flickered faintly as she nodded. Not just a symbol, an embodiment, a reminder of what happens when a species embraces power without wisdom, when a force is unleashed without understanding the consequences. The hippopotamus doesn't follow the rules that we, as intelligent species, have set for ourselves. It doesn't seek balance. It simply exists, a force of nature unchained. My mind raced. I had never imagined that such a simple animal could hold such meaning for these beings. But I didn't mean to cause any harm. I thought it would be a good way to show how different Earth animals are. I know you didn't intend harm, Valora responded, her tone gentle yet firm. But the truth is that many of us were once like the hippopotamus. We once thrived on chaos too. We once ruled over destruction, but we learned, over millennia, the importance of balance. And the hippopotamus, for some, represents the fear that we may one day return to that we may awaken forces we cannot control. Her words left a hollow feeling in my chest. What had I stumbled upon? Why had the hippopotamus, of all creatures, stirred such a deep collective fear in these species? It was just a large animal, an oversized mammal from a small planet on the edge of the galaxy. But clearly I had tapped into something far larger than I understood. As I processed this, Valora continued, her tone more somber. You are different, human. You represent something none of us can quite grasp. There's a strength in you that none of us can fully explain. But it is that same strength that terrifies us. I frowned, trying to make sense of her words. How does that make sense? What do you mean? I'm just a regular person. I'm not special. You are, Valora insisted. There's something about your species that is unique. Your capacity to endure, to adapt, and to push forward despite impossible odds. The hippopotamus is a manifestation of those primal forces. It represents the raw, unbridled power that resides within your kind, and that power scares us. A wave of realization washed over me. This wasn't just about the hippopotamus. It wasn't even about Earth. It was about the potential of humanity, the deep-seated power that lay dormant in our species. Something that the aliens here were beginning to sense and fear. It dawned on me that I wasn't just a student in this academy. I was a part of something much larger, a puzzle piece in a galactic picture I could barely comprehend. My presence here, my very existence, was shaking things up in ways I couldn't predict. And though I had no idea where it would lead, I knew one thing for certain. I had just begun to understand the true impact of my arrival. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and introspection. My interactions with the other students had become increasingly strained, and despite Valora's calm explanations, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play. My presence here, on Viltoria 4, among these highly advanced alien species, had become a source of tension. Every conversation I had felt charged with an undercurrent of fear, as though I were somehow the catalyst for something they couldn't quite control or predict. Zork had become more distant, and even his usual stoic demeanor seemed to have faltered. The normally confident Voltorian was now wrapped in an aura of unease. Whenever I tried to speak to him, his responses were short and distracted, as if his mind was elsewhere. I knew I had crossed a line, but I wasn't sure how to fix it. How could I undo the damage I'd done by simply showing a few holograms of an Earth animal? Valora, too, had grown quieter. Although her telepathic presence was still there, it no longer offered the same sense of warmth and reassurance it once had. She was withdrawn, her thoughts layered with apprehension. It was as though the hippopotamus had revealed something too deep, too primal, for any of them to deal with easily. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered whether the fear they were experiencing was connected to something that went beyond their personal feelings toward the hippopotamus. Maybe it wasn't just about the animal. It was about me, he says. I found myself in the library one evening, searching through texts on Viltorian history, trying to find any mention of the forces Valora had described. I couldn't help but feel that the key to understanding their fear was hidden somewhere in their past, perhaps something tied to their ancient history that they weren't willing to speak of. The library was vast, and the bookshelves stretched endlessly in every direction, filled with texts from civilizations far older than anything I could comprehend. As I scrolled through various holographic scrolls, I stumbled upon a passage that caught my eye. It was buried deep in an ancient manuscript, an old Viltorian text that seemed to be more allegorical than scientific. The words were cryptic, but the message was clear. It spoke of a time before their civilization had risen to its current state, a time when the galaxy was torn by endless wars, chaos, and destruction. This was a period they referred to as the Era of the Unbound, and it was described as an age where beings like the hippopotamus were not only common, but revered for their raw, untamed power. The text was filled with warnings about creatures that thrived on destruction and violence, creatures like the hippopotamus who existed outside the bounds of reason and logic. It was said that these beings, though seemingly primitive, carried within them a power that could never truly be controlled. Their existence was a reminder of what could happen when power was abused, when species embraced destruction over harmony. In addition to man slaughtering animals and eating their corpses, the colorful creatures came alive, their skin turning the color of blood. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine as I read further. The passage mentioned that during this era of the Unbound, entire star systems had fallen, civilizations had crumbled, and the very fabric of reality had been threatened by the unchecked forces of chaos. There were vague references to ancient beings, older than any known species, who had brought the galaxy to the brink of collapse. These beings were said to have used creatures like the hippopotamus as symbols of their power, their ability to wreak havoc without reason or remorse. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to piece together the fragmented history of these ancient wars. The text spoke of a cataclysmic event that had shattered the fabric of reality itself, an event that had forced every intelligent species to come together in a desperate effort to restore order to the universe. The hippopotamus, it seemed, was not just an animal. It was a symbol of the chaos that had once consumed everything. The fear it evoked was not just personal, it was collective. It was the fear of a past that had nearly destroyed everything. I was interrupted by the sudden presence of Valora. She stood quietly behind me, her ethereal form glowing softly in the dim light of the library. I hadn't sensed her approach, and for a moment, I was struck by the silence she carried with her. There was no urgency in her movement, no sign of hostility. She seemed resigned. "You've found it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost mournful. "The truth." I turned slowly, looking at her with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What is this? What does all of this mean? Why is the hippopotamus such a threat to you? Valora sighed, the sound filled with centuries of grief. The hippopotamus is not a threat in itself. It is a symbol of something much older, something we all wish to forget. The era of the Unbound was a time when the universe was ruled by creatures like the hippopotamus, creatures of pure, unbridled power, existing without any regard for the consequences of their actions. It was a time of endless war, of destruction on a scale that none of us can comprehend. The beings who ruled then were like the hippopotamus, primitive but with a power that could not be controlled. She paused, her gaze distant, as if lost in a memory that weighed heavily on her. The fear you see in us now is not just about the hippopotamus. It is the fear that your kind, the humans, may be like those ancient beings, that you may carry within you the same raw, uncontrollable power. It is not just the hippopotamus that frightens us. It is the possibility that humanity may one day tap into that same chaos, that same destruction. Her words struck me like a blow, and for the first time since arriving on Viltoria 4, I truly understood the weight of what I had unleashed. It wasn't just about an animal or a creature. It was about the fear of humanity's potential, of what we might one day become if we lost our way. I never intended to bring this kind of fear, I said quietly, my voice trembling with realization. I had no idea. Valora's gaze softened, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something like pity in her eyes. I know you didn't, but your kind, human, you are unlike any we have ever encountered, and that is both your greatest strength and your most terrifying flaw. The following weeks were a whirlwind of introspection and uneasy silence. I couldn't shake Valora's words from my mind. Every interaction with my classmates felt heavy, as if a barrier had been erected between us. I could sense their eyes on me, though they tried to hide it. Every time I entered a room, the subtle shift in the air, like a collective breath being held, was impossible to ignore. The hippopotamus had become a symbol, yes, but more than that. It had become a mirror, reflecting fears that none of us had fully acknowledged. I spent days in isolation, seeking solace in my studies, trying to lose myself in the vast knowledge of Viltora afford. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the weight of the situation. The more I read, the more I realized that the stories Viltora had shared were just the beginning. I had only scratched the surface of their history, and every new text I uncovered seemed to lead me deeper into a past none of them seemed eager to discuss. Despite the growing distance between me and my classmates, there were still moments when I could see glimpses of the beings they once were, the beings I had come to know in the early days of my time on this planet. Zork's sharp wit, Valora's gentle wisdom, and Snef's irreverent humor had all seemed like facets of a far more harmonious existence. Now, those traits were buried beneath layers of caution and fear. It wasn't just the hippopotamus anymore. It was me. I had become the unspoken variable in their equation, the unknown factor that they couldn't quite predict. One evening, as I sat alone in my dorm, the door chimed, pulling me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. To my surprise, Zork stood in the doorway, his usual expression softened by something I hadn't seen in him before: regret. "I need to talk to you, human," he said, his voice low, but his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that caught me off guard. I nodded slowly, stepping aside to allow him in. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, a tension I couldn't fully grasp. We sat across from each other, the silence pressing in from all sides. Zork shifted uncomfortably, his tail twitching. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone uncertain, "about the hippopotamus, about what it represents." I swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "What do you mean?" Zork's gaze softened, but there was still a wariness in his eyes. "We've been avoiding the truth, you and I," he said. "The truth about what you brought into this place. The hippopotamus is more than just an animal, but it's also not the source of the fear we've been feeling." I frowned, still not understanding. "What do you mean? You all acted like it was a symbol of something dangerous. I thought you were all afraid of it." "We were afraid of it, yes," Zork admitted. but not because of the hippopotamus itself. We feared what it represented, not just chaos, but the very thing you brought with it when you showed it to us. He paused, as though struggling to find the right words. You showed us something that we've never allowed ourselves to confront: humanity's potential. I blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. My potential? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Zork nodded. Yes. The hippopotamus symbolizes the raw power within your species, a power that can be either creative or destructive, a force that can reshape worlds, one of creation or one of ruin. We are afraid, human, because we have seen what happens when that potential is unleashed without understanding. We have seen civilizations collapse under the weight of their own unchecked power. I felt a chill wash over me. So, you're saying that you're afraid of me? Zork's eyes softened, his voice quieter now. Not you, exactly, but your potential. The way your kind can rise to greatness or fall into chaos. We feared what might happen if you tapped into that power. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the very air had thickened. I had never once thought of my species in this way, and it was a strange, almost terrifying thing to hear. To be seen as a species capable of such profound influence was humbling, but the fear in Zork's voice, the reverence for the power we could wield, sent shivers down my spine. What does that mean for me? I asked, my voice trembling with uncertainty. What am I supposed to do now? How do I even begin to understand all of this? Zork's gaze held mine, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of the old camaraderie I had once shared with him. You have the potential to change everything, human, he said, his voice steady. But whether that change will be for good or ill depends on how you choose to wield that power. We are not afraid of you, but we are wary, and we must learn together how to navigate this, how to ensure that the power you carry does not lead to destruction. The room felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I didn't know what to say or how to respond. I felt like I had just been handed the key to some vast and unknowable force, one that could either heal the galaxy or tear it apart. And the worst part? I didn't know if I was ready for that responsibility. As Zork stood up to leave, he gave me one last look. We will help you, human, but you must be willing to learn. And you must be ready to face the truth of who you are and what your species is capable of. I watched him leave, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process everything he had said. I had come to this world hoping to learn and fit in, to share a piece of Earth with these incredible beings. But now, I realized, I was something much more than just a student. I was a force in their world, a part of a much larger narrative than I had ever imagined. And whether I was ready or not, the future was waiting for me to shape it.